started. Well, I think we'll get started. Good evening and welcome to the Minneapolis College of Art and Design. I'm Carrie Morgan and I'm the gallery director here, and I also have the pleasure of being the program director for the McKnight Visual Artist Fellowships. This is our third installment of the McKnight discussion series that pairs two of our McKnight fellows with one visiting curator or critic. And this is the second year that we've hosted these public events, and tonight I'm very pleased to be introducing tonight's participants. Our invited critic this evening is Michael Rooks. He is the Wieland Family Curator of Modern and Contemporary Art at the High Museum in Atlanta, Georgia. Before assuming this role in January of 2010, Michael was a curator at the Museum of Contemporary Art Chicago, the Contemporary Museum Honolulu, and at the Honolulu Academy of Arts. Some of Michael's exhibitions at the High Museum of Art have included workshopping an American model of architectural practice, which was at the U.S. Pavilion at the 12th International Architecture Exhibition in Venice in 2010, a cause downtime, and two historical survey exhibitions entitled Picasso to Warhol, 14 Modern Masters, and Fast Forward, Modern Moments, 1913 to 2013. He is currently at work on a major survey of the work of Al Taylor, which will open at the High Museum in November of this year. I would also like to note that Michael was the 2015 recipient of the Nexus Award, which is a public acknowledgement of individuals, groups, organizations that have made a significant contribution to the contemporary arts landscape in Atlanta. We're very glad to have him here. Our two esteemed 2015 McKnight Fellows featured this evening are Tracy Crum and Alexandros Lindsay. Tracy Crum is a sculptor, educator, and researcher engaged with an ongoing body of work that investigates relationships between labor, gender, duality, time, and culture. Her work has been exhibited internationally in over 175 gallery and museum exhibitions over the past 25 years. Some of those have included the Triennial of Textiles at the Central Museum in Lodz, Poland, the Fine Arts Museum of New Mexico in Santa Fe, the American Craft Museum in New York, the Kohler Art Center in Sheboygan, Wisconsin, and the National Museum of Women in the Arts in Washington, D.C. Tracy received her BFA from the California College of Arts and Crafts and her MFA in Visual Art from Vermont College. Alexandros Lindsay is an artist who uses mixed media to explore subjects overlooked in American society. His process of moving cultural symbols to different contexts frees them from their pre-existing meaning and opens them up for new interpretation. Alex, among his different awards, has won second place in installation at the 2011 Florence Biennial and was a 2013 Jerome Fellow at Franconia Sculpture Park. He has exhibited in shows both nationally and internationally, including solo shows at the Casket Arts Building. One is upcoming, opening in May of this year. And he's also been in group exhibitions at the Weissman Art Museum. He has a BFA from the Museum of Fine Arts Boston and an MFA from Cranbrook Academy of Art. And finally, I want to thank again, as we will continue doing forever and ever, the McKnight Foundation for making so many good things happen for our Minnesota artists. This evening's events are included. Our McKnight Fellows, in addition to receiving $25,000 awards each to use as they see fit, are also provided an additional $3,000 to use for professional development. And over the two-year fellowship, they are afforded the opportunity to meet with 6 visiting critics, 4 of whom are invited back to moderate these discussions. The fellows also have access to MCAD's facilities and lots of great dinners out. It is always an honor and privilege to facilitate these fellowships, and I'm grateful for the assistance that many staff at MCAD provide me, such as our in-house design firm DesignWorks, our webmasters Tabitha Leskarov, Stephen Candy, and Josie Kelfenheim, and most of all, our fellowship coordinator Melanie Pinkow, and our 2 graduate assistants Michaela Korn and Erin Olsen-Reiners. Finally, again, I want to thank Arleta Little, Kristen Marks, and Vicki Benson at the McKnight Foundation. These women do a lot of work on our behalf, and I'm very thankful for this opportunity to work with so many outstanding Minnesota artists, as well as guest curators and critics. So I'll turn over the podium to Michael. Thanks.
Carrie, thank you so much. Thanks to MCAD, Carrie, to the McKnight Foundation. I love doing studio visits with students, practicing artists, you name it. It's something that really keeps my job interesting. Working in a museum is not always so interesting. And this is the one thing that I really do cherish. So I really do appreciate the invitation last year and being re-invited back to have this conversation with Alex and Tracy tonight. When I began my career, I wanted to be an artist myself, and maybe it's one of the reasons why I value artists so much. It's not that artists are special. They are. I think everybody, there's a little special something in everybody. But artists do something that speaks to me and always has as a person. And so I tried to be an artist. I tried. And I went to art school, went to School of the Art Institute of Chicago to study painting. And I realized after visiting with Alex and with Tracy that when I learned about what makes art making such an incredible kind of activity, such an incredibly special kind of activity, was not in art school, but was before I went to art school, when I was actually working in my dad's garage, mechanic. My dad's mechanic, and I built and rebuilt my own cars. And when I loved doing auto body work on my cars, basically taking the body off the car, fixing it, patching it, stripping it down, and repainting it. And I would do these incredible lacquer paint jobs, 8, 10, 12 layers of lacquer paint, which is really difficult, time-consuming. And but it's in those moments that I recalled after my visit with Alex particularly, that it's when I realized the value of labor and the satisfaction of doing something that's physical, for which there is an end product that has an aesthetic value, that represents time and patience and endurance and physical activity, and is the product of a kind of love also, but also of physical skill and talent and knowledge. All this stuff that I learned while several summers of rebuilding and repainting automobiles that I sadly sold. So this idea of craftsmanship, of personal satisfaction, artistic satisfaction in doing and making, and understanding that as a special kind of love, but also a different kind of knowledge set that informs everything else in life, is why I pursued the idea of becoming an artist and failed at it, but then found that I was actually better at being an audience for artists and learning from artists and trying to understand my world, continue understanding my world through them. So when I visited with Tracy and with Alex, those two things were aspects of what they do that struck me as very personally as something that I still find incredible value in, and something that strikes me in the gut. I mean, that's how I usually think as a critic or a curator. Previously as a critic, before I was a curator, my gut response was really what I trusted first, and that's what I kind of took away from my visit here last year, was this incredible attention to making and working, and the integrity of work in both Alex and Tracy's studio. Upon reflection, also today, after we met today, it's interesting that you both, for both of you, travel is important. And it's something maybe I think we'll talk about later. Travel in different aspects of travel, rather. I think for Tracy, travel is research, and for Alex, travel is something that comes out of research, out of the research that you do. The kind of travel you do is maybe more philosophical, maybe more metaphorical, but the same kind of journey that I think I'm talking about with both of you, where research and the idea of liberation. I think you said it earlier this morning, actually. You probably don't want me to say this, but salvation in work, right? Finding salvation in work. So for me, travel, getting on the road, really like the American myth of being on the road, whether it's on the road literally in a car or it's on the road with a suitcase to Guatemala, hunting down incredible examples of textiles, is a kind of liberation, a salvation, whether it's spiritual, personal, emancipation from your job, from the drudgeries of everyday work and the people who make life dangerous on the streets when you're driving, and just a kind of intellectual and kind of liberation, if not only also physical. Anyway, so I'm kind of spitballing here, but these are the things that I feel are points of departure for me in conducting a conversation tonight with the two of you. And just to fill you all in, we're going to be pretty casual. Alex and Tracy are going to present their work, and then we're going to sit down and have a conversation, and then we'll follow that up with a Q&A about 15 minutes before we wrap up. So with that, I am going to ask Tracy to come on up. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, I got to go up to play. Here we go. All right. I think you can probably hear me even if I'm not talking into the microphone. I did a little bit of a different take with this presentation. I talked into my phone when I've never done that before. I've never actually written anything when I've given a presentation. So I'm going to just give you a couple little background things on me. I have been a maker my whole life. Learned craft processes and textile processes from my grandmothers back in the 60s. Was heavily involved in experiential education in the 70s and the 80s. And then found out that, let me get some images going here. Found out when I went to college that you could actually get a degree in something called textiles as part of the art world, and I didn't know anything about that. I was actually a political ecology major who had always been a maker and had always really engaged in craft as a way of expression. So I made a switch a couple years through college and decided to go into art, and my professor said to me, well, there's a really great school down in California, and I loved Berkeley, and so I went to California. And to back up even further than that, I grew up in Minnesota. I went to Pratt School in Prospect Park, was my elementary school, and then graduated from high school in Burnsville, and then I left for 33 years and came back when I was 50. So, excuse me, I have a cold, so if it seems like I have to stop and drink, that's what I have to do. One other thing I'm going to say is I've lectured. I taught college for 15 years, mostly in community arts and service learning and in textile programs, North Carolina State University and Kansas City Art Institute, and most recently River Falls. And I was giving a lecture maybe 10 years ago at Memphis College of Art, and I had a slide get stuck in a carousel. And so I had to end this. The slide got stuck because there was an old slide label from a slide that was even older than the slides I was showing stuck in the carousel, and so I had to end the lecture halfway through and just kind of wing it. And so tonight, a similar sort of thing happened. For 15 years later, my computer started doing an update, and I hadn't backed up my presentation. So I'm showing some slides. The slides that I'm showing are just from the work from the last 2 years since I got McKnight. So I was really honored to come back to Minnesota, spend 2 years here, and then get a McKnight Fellowship, which just really kind of solidified for me what I was going to do for the rest of my life, knowing that I was an artist and had always engaged in my studio practice anyway. It really sort of helped me realize that I wasn't going to have another career after teaching, that I was really going to just continue with my studio practice and try to do it in a different way. And I'm not quite sure how to explain how it is different, but we'll talk about some of that, I think. When I was away from Minnesota, I traveled a lot. I probably traveled at least 1 million miles. I traveled all over the world, primarily Europe and Central and South America are my favorite places. And my connection to the world was really through the vocabulary of textiles and visual art, and that vocabulary. And even if I couldn't speak the language of the people in the country that I was in, I was able to communicate through making processes. And that's really important. So as I had this 2-year period with the support of the McKnight Fellowship, I really thought a lot about how I was going to try to transform the work that I had been doing, because I felt like a lot of times people do when they go to graduate school, which for me was, over 20 years ago. You really maybe feel like you need to engage with people intellectually and have some support for your studio practice. And so I feel like this last couple of years for me was sort of like a revisit of what graduate school had been for me over 20 years ago. So I proceeded to do what I would call a body of work. I had 2 exhibitions during this period, and one was with my dealer in San Francisco. I've been represented commercially for 25 years. That's how I make a living. And then I had another show at Metro State University. And the show at Metro State was a really great opportunity for me to actually have a show in Minnesota, which I had never done in my lifetime. And so all the people that I knew growing up could see what I had done for the last 30 years, or how I'd gotten to where I was. So there were a lot of sort of different things that I was exploring: 2D, 3D, construction. I'm a maker. My work is very much about labor and gender, as I think you said in the introduction, Carrie. I'm a thinking through making person, and so I can't figure out what I'm doing unless I'm engaged in process. And so I crochet wire. That's what you're looking at here, folks. Among other things. But what I thought a lot about in the last couple of years, I wasn't really sure how I was going to spend my McKnight funds, and so I did some traveling, because that's really what keeps me inspired and what keeps me going. It's that sort of relationship with the world. It's not looking at other art anymore. It's not research. I mean, I've been practicing for over 30 years as a professional artist, so I have a little bit different take on how I need to spend my time and what I really need to do anymore. So I finished some new pieces. I started exploring working with glass. I thought, okay, maybe I need to introduce another material. How can I sort of change up my working methods? So I had done a number of collaborative pieces before, and I started working with Michael Boyd from the Minnesota Center for Glass Arts, and he started blowing glass into my metal, my crocheted metal, and it's actually very different than making a rigid welded frame. This is actually a textile made of metal, so it expands when you're blowing the glass into it, and so the shape, the control, there's always sort of a dance with the control of the shape. It's like if you blow too much, the glass breaks or the metal breaks, something happens. So that was a fun experience that we worked on really for the last couple of years, and we haven't quite figured out where we're going to go with it. But it culminated in these 2 pieces, the last one that was up, and then this one that you're currently looking at. And then this is a detail of the glass forms. Couple more pieces that I finished this past year. I do a lot of work that has to do, it's very self-referential, so I would say that, on some level or another, that my work is, there's a lot of self-portraiture involved. There's a lot of sort of identity and exploration of identity through my work for me. These last 2 pieces, this one and the one previous, are human scale or a little bit bigger, maybe 7 feet high. And then I have started working with this idea about sort of making textiles about textiles, and it's really for me to pay homage to other cultures that I have been with and that I have people that I have worked with, and using their language of pattern and use of color in a way that I think is relevant to how I maybe think about it. So I did a couple of, actually this is 2 of a series, kind of an ongoing series of flat pieces that are constructed to reference textiles from other cultures. This, in particular, this is a direct reference for me to Guatemala. I've spent several months there over the course of my life. So the last couple pieces I'm going to show are kind of where I got to in terms of thinking about the most meaningful things for me in terms of carrying things forward from the last couple of years into my studio practice and what I'm currently looking at. And that is this first piece. This was a piece that I did for the show that I had in San Francisco, and it sold. And so I got a call from an art agent who was doing a hotel in Abu Dhabi, and they wanted something like this piece, but they wanted it to be about 3 times bigger. So this piece is maybe 40 by 40 inches. And then this is the larger response to it. It's probably about 8 feet wide. And this was something that I had really wanted to try. I had never consciously duplicated something. Oftentimes I've worked in a series on several pieces and they may actually look similar and there's subtle differences in them, but this was somebody calling me, you know, 6 months later and saying, we're going to give you X amount of money if you make this thing for us. And I thought, you know, I don't have a regular job. I don't want to find a regular job. Of course I'm going to do this. And so, you know, for me it was an experience of figuring out, like, the piece that preceded this felt really authentic, and it was really just an instinctual response and being engaged in my studio practice and how I think about the world. Whereas this piece took on sort of a different mode of operation for me. I really ended up finding myself engaging with kind of a system in order to get the work done. And so there's sort of a dishonesty in terms of what I had to do to get this done, which I don't feel bad or good about it. It was just how it just taught me a lesson about, you know, do I want to sort of pursue these things, and do I want to, you know, how do I feel about repeating myself? And then the last piece that was sort of an exploration of where I want to move forward was another situation where somebody asked me to do a project for them, but this was I'm going to say a site-specific piece, but where I had been asked to do the piece was not where it ended up being installed. And so I had developed this whole thing, and I'd set it up in the studio, and a couple of the critics had seen it. And when I got there to do the installation, I only had a couple weeks to do it, and the actual material that went into this probably took 6 months to make. And so I said, oh, I got all this stuff in my studio, I'll bring it in, we'll drape some fabric, you know, I'll drape this metal and figure out what I'm doing. And when I got there, they said, well, we don't want to put it inside of our office. We want to put it in the hallway, and we want it to be something that people experience when they get off the elevator. And we're rebranding our company, and the company's name is Thread. And so you're the perfect artist, and you're going to do this thing. And I was like, wow. Okay, so the space was somewhat problematic because it was pretty tight space, and there was, you know, duct work up in the ceilings, and whatever. So I also referenced, I went to the Minnesota Historical Society, which is something I never do, and I did some research on mapping, because mapping is something, because I've traveled so much, mapping is something that's always been in my mind, but it's not something that I've ever, you know, really, seriously referenced. So I went and I looked at some maps of Northeast Minneapolis, and it sort of helped inspire me in terms of the shape and colors I was using, and gave me some guidance, because this was something new for me. And I think I still feel like this piece is problematic in some ways, and part of it is because it still just doesn't rest with me. It feels so different from the rest of the work that I've made in my studio over the last 20 years that you know, I'm not going to make another one. But what did come out of it was I'm really interested in this idea of of layering and making massive amounts of fabric and then pressing that all into some sort of a maybe two-dimensional plane. I'm not really sure. So what I'm looking at is just how to use my own material differently and how to use the way that I've thought about things. When you're in your mid-50s, you think about things very differently than you do when you're 30 and you have your whole sort of young art career in front of you. So for me, it's kind of finding my way on a new path through the work that I've been doing. And I think I'm just going to end with that. And this wasn't the slide I was going to end on, but that slide is stuck in my computer. So it's all good. And I've been winging it for decades, so.
Is there any way we can get the lights down? I have some videos. So I'm going to show you 3 works today. And the first one's kind of the most important one. There's a big story behind it, so you're going to have to bear with me. And it all starts with going to a car auction in Pontiac, Michigan. I was in grad school at the time, and I had this thing I had picked out and knew exactly what I wanted. I was living in Michigan. So I go up to this car auction, and
get the absolute lowest prices on cars, trucks, and SUVs at VOA Auto Auction.
Volunteers of America Auto Auction.
Auctions every Saturday at 10 a.m. and preview cars Friday from 10 to 4. Get incredible deals. Sold $800. Sold $600. Sold $850. Sold $700. VOA Auto Auction on East Walton and Pontiac. Call 1-800-552-1515 and preview cars online at voaautoauction.org.
VOA thanks you.
so I went to car auction, and I proceeded to break the first rule of going to an auction and bid on something I had no intention of buying. Ended up with this beautiful Pontiac Le Mans, except it really wasn't so beautiful. It was kind of a piece of junk. And I tried fixing it. I tried doing some different things to it. I ended up at this place where I was trying to understand why I had this car, where it came from, why did I buy this car, what was the deal with it. And after some experimentation, I realized the most interesting thing about the car was the body itself and the shape and the volume. And so I peeled off all the panels, and I had the rest of the car hauled off to the junkyard. And so I was left there with just the shell of the car. It existed in some different sculptural forms. And after leaving Michigan and returning to Minnesota, I ended up trailering the car body back with me. It came home, and I tried a couple different things. And after I think it was a year, I made a new piece with it. And this is actually at the Franconia Casket Space in Northeast Minneapolis. I ended up covering it in a tarp and putting a rotating light in it and hanging it from the ceiling of the gallery. There was something that happened in this resurrection. Something kind of that I discovered that I wasn't expecting that was happening with this car. And a lot of people came in, and I got different responses. I got, this used to be the car I went to school with. You know, this reminds me of this car, of this old 70s car, and it was a piece of junk and we had a ride in it. Or it was, you know, this is my husband's car. He had this car. He was sitting beside his house, and he beside the house, and he dreamed of fixing it up. It sat on cinder blocks without wheels, and never did it. Just sat there for decades. And another person even said, someone that spent time in Michigan came up to me and he said, "This is the story of Detroit. This is like, you know, this is kind of like reminds me of the lost city or whatever." And so, you know, it kind of put me in this weird place. Like, what's happening with this car? Why is it so successful? You know, here's this one thing, this object that's traveled with me all this time. And so at the time I was reading these stories about castle builders in the Pacific Northwest and American castle builders. And in order to understand American castle builders, you kind of have to go back and look at one of the first contemporary castle builders, which is Carl Jung. And when Jung decided, when he kind of finished his career and retired, he decided to build a castle on Lake Zurich. And when he built this castle, he asked himself a question. He asked himself, what myth do I live by? And he kind of commented, says, what a thing it is to live with a myth, and what a thing it is to live without one. So I don't want you to think that I'm interested in myth, because that's not what it is. What I found was interesting was the idea of living without a myth, the void, the absence of it. And the question was, how is the car existing in that space, in that void that myth used to be in? And there was a discovery of finding that the car was what I coined a Pan-American object or place, and that it had a story, but you couldn't really figure out what the story was. It implied narrative. There was some sort of implication of narrative. And the third thing, which is kind of funky, is it had something mystic about it. There was a ghostliness to the car. So you have the car. It seems like there's a story, and there's something ghostly with the tarp. So I'll show you so the next piece after kind of discovering kind of that journey with the car was the highway that was at Franconia Sculpture Park. So Franconia, if you all haven't been there, I highly encourage that you take a day trip and head up to Taylor's Falls and have a visit. One of the many missions of Franconia is to return the field to pre-colonial prairie, to the conditions that were there. And so that requires removing the invasive species that kind of have moved in over the years, and planting it with these new species of prairie grass. And most of the sculptures there exist within kind of a mowed area. So there's paths that lead through the prairie, and then there is kind of a circular area that the sculptures exist. And I asked the director at the time, who was kind enough to come, if I could use the prairie itself as a material. Could I put the sculpture physically into the prairie grass? And so what I was looking at was I was interested in the prairie, and then also interested in the highway and the environment that surrounds the park. And one of the things is when you're there, you can hear the cars howling by. You can hear that there is traffic around you, and you can actually see it, but at the same time, you're displaced. You're in this restored environment that was indicative of what Minnesota might have looked like, pre Western civilization. One of the things I investigated was a journey, and there's two journeys. There's one going north and one going south, and they are projected within this box truck that, let me go back, which is a box from a box van. It was removed, and then it was placed, I placed it on a I-beam, and the box truck moves slowly throughout the day. So when you approach it, you do not notice that it moves. But if you were to watch the video, maybe stroll, do something, go to a different part of the park and return, you'll notice the box has actually moved. It's not where it started. And it plays one video during that one course. And once it gets to the end of the track, it changes video and changes direction. The piece, and the piece is not apparent that you see its mechanism or see how it works. The I-beam is, you can see, is pretty much buried within the grass, and takes some investigation of getting up close or really looking carefully to see the trolley that moves it. And here I have both the videos side by side, but you'd have to wait several hours before it would switch directions and play the next video. And then, just skip ahead, here's a time lapse of it moving. So that's a whole day, so you can imagine it's moving incredibly slow. So the next piece I'm going to show you is, it's called Moving Walkway, and it was at the Wiseman Art Museum. It opened during Northern Spark in 2015, and the exhibition featured 5 Twin Cities-based artists, and the curator asked every artist to do a piece based on time. And every artist that was participating had a very different practice. So each piece was very different, and it just had that one, the one connecting thread. And so I was faced with the idea, okay, what do I investigate, and what is this common place that has an interesting element of time to it? And I ended up thinking, well, the airport's a pretty interesting place when relating to time. And I built this sculpture that, sculpture/installation, comprised of a couple parts. Let's see. It had a reflecting pool that was about 12 feet by 12 feet. Well, not exactly 12 feet by 12 feet. There was a copper tank that was full of water, and 2 projections projecting in portrait position, not landscape. The copper tank was filled with water and then set to a very, very slow drip. So it became this vessel of time. It's the most ancient and basic and rough way that you can measure a unit of time. And so it would slowly drip out over several months, and sometimes it would drip regularly, sometimes slowly, sometimes fast. And every time it dripped, there was a little fountain that would go off, and you could see the ripples up in the ceiling. And there was a chandelier piece that you wouldn't notice at first, but it was kind of reminiscent of the arms of a clock or some sort of mechanism. And here in this photo, it's really apparent that the chandelier's there, but when you first approached it, you really saw because of the height of the ceiling, you would just see the pool and the tank and the videos. And the videos are at the scale that they feel like a doorway, around 7.5 feet tall. So close-up of the drip. There's the fountain in the center. The light. This is the video. Okay. And there was one other element. Every time it would drip, there was a counter simply digitizing those drips. So you had this very extremely analog, extremely inaccurate way of signifying time. And you had a device on the wall counting it off. And that was combined with, these are what the videos look like. It's just a part of, there was a much larger video, but this is just a small piece of it. I believe they were like 3-hour loops or something. And there was always, on one screen, one conveyor was going one way, and the other screen, the other conveyor was moving the opposite direction. And then I'd also like to invite all of you to come to a show that I'm having at Casket Art Center. That's Franconia's space within the Twin Cities. And we have a reception on May 19th from 4 to 6. Love it if you could all make it, if you'd like to see some of the latest work that I've been working on over the last 2 years during the fellowship. I'll have a few things up, so please come. Thank you.
Okay, so grab your mic. Alex, thank you, and Tracy, thanks very much for your great presentations. I really want to get back to what you were talking about myth, but we will. I think if we start where I thought we should start, maybe, and that's with thinking. I mean, when we spoke yesterday, Tracy, I believe you talked about ways of thinking. And you mentioned it in your talk that you think through making. You think through making today. When we were speaking, you were describing how there is very little difference between the two things. In other words, there's this incredible co-agency between your what goes on in your head and your hand. And it brought to mind, because we both have an affinity for Hawaii, hula.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, the art of hula, which is a very beautiful and sacred dance, not this lascivious thing that Americans turned it into in their early 20th century, is something that wherein this co-agency really exists, and the hands, which are making gestures, are what the eyes follow. But the eyes follow the hands a few inches above the fingers, or the hand, and a distance beyond. But it's really, the eyes are following the hand, and the hand is transcribing what's going on in the mind. So there's this circular thing going on, but you can't differentiate, you can't pull them apart. So that's what I was thinking about in your work, and in that relationship between hand and mind. I was thinking about sort of a liminal space. I mean, it's like a space that's in between the subconscious and the conscious mind, and that was something you were talking about earlier in terms of myth. Anyway, so can maybe we talk about that idea, these ideas about ways of thinking in both of your practices?
So I'll start with that. This idea about thinking through making, for me, also really relates to just the marking of time, and that's something that I feel like there's an affinity with Alex's work in terms of that, because we're both marking time in our work, but we're doing it with extremely different outcomes and in different ways. So for me, if I'm not engaged in the process of making my own material, everybody always asks me, oh, why can't you just go buy this stuff and use this? And I can't figure out what I'm doing if I'm not engaged with my hands. And I think that people who consider themselves makers, I consider myself an object maker, and I've always thought, and to put it this way, the simplest way I can put it is that as a maker, I'm channeling energy through my hands. I mean, I know that's not supposed to sound like new age and hokey, but it's really true. It's like everything I think about, and everything that I need to manifest has to come through my hands, because I'm directly engaged with my materials, and I'm so interested in the possibilities of materials, and the inherent properties of materials and all that sort of stuff. So this whole idea of through the hand, the experience of really being engaged with the hand and letting that guide and sort of be a big part of my tuition and about a part of how I figure out what I'm doing is I mean, that's just been with me since I was young. I don't know that that's something that you can teach somebody. I think it's something, at least for me, it's just such a big part of my experience as a person. So, I've thought about my work as like this very stitch by stitch process. I'm building like a molecular structure. I get to the end when the molecular structure is complete. And so, the idea of the stitch marking time, being a part of being part of a process of counting, that's all very relevant in terms of how I think about what I do and how I talk about it. And I think that, in an abstract way, as Alex and I have been talking for the last couple of weeks, that there's a lot that relates to how he engages in his process and gets to the results that he gets to.
Is that true?
I think so. And I actually, as you expressed that, I was thinking about the process of filmmaking and how the sculptural process, because you've got to have, there's a lot of planning, you got to think about materials, you got to think about cost, and then just the logistics of constructing it is so much different than the playfulness that happens with being able to have a camera and go out and gather some images and then bring them in, and we even had the conversation about like Super 8 filmmaking and that like moment of discovery, and then seeing like, okay, if I'm shooting in high speed, and then there's a kind of notion that, okay, this site or this place is interesting and has this thing that needs to be investigated and be deconstructed with the camera, but it's not. That process is so much different than the sculptures that they end up getting incorporated into. That I would say that there is some similarity in that fashion.
We talked about earlier today about tinkering, right?
Mm-hmm.
So is that analogous in any way? I mean, what Tracy does, thinking by making, is this incredibly complex, I think, system of thinking through problems and solving problems. And tinkering is a similar, in some ways, very similar because it's, as I understand the idea of tinkering, that it's like you're working without any clear direction with a set of givens. But then you, through experimentation, discover something or discover new directions. Anyway.
Well,
I mean, is that a way of thinking
yeah.
with your hands as well, I guess is what I'm trying to ask.
For me, I would say no, just because an end result is needed, and planning is such a big part of the construction.
Mm-hmm.
I guess when I was saying with that tactile thing and the discovery with the camera as a way of thinking was, for instance, in the shot of shooting the airport, there was that moment when the soldiers were coming down the moving walkway, and that added a different layer to the whole piece, because you end up with this thing. Is that, and I didn't even I shot for a whole day, different moving walkways, and I had to, position the camera in a way that it was hidden, and also work within the permitting constraints of the airport, and so that I, had several clips, and I didn't even recall exactly where everything was. And you see these soldiers, and you get this moment, and it's like, okay, are they leaving or are they going home? You don't even know that, and then that question within, them with their duffel bags is, so profound that it added a whole different layer to the timepiece and what I was doing, and that sort of flexibility just wasn't with the rest of the sculpture wasn't available, because the glass had to be designed and sent to some special place to be cut, and had to figure out the logistics of how all that was going to be constructed and moved and so on.
So that's interesting. I mean, is there so what you described about the video with the soldiers, which I responded to as well, especially you just filmed it in a high speed, right?
Yes, correct.
So it was very slow. And then, because I had this first question in my head, I was going to ask you guys about, in terms of liminality and the space that, is neither there or here nor there. And airports are those spaces, right? You're neither here nor there. And they're great metaphors also for sort of a transcendence or moving from one realm to another. So, but that's a very kind of, it's very emotional. Is that a valid kind of take on your work? And is there, for Tracy, how does emotion play in what you do? And is there a part that emotion plays in your practice, I guess?
I don't know that I've ever really thought about emotion. I know that I've had a number of friends, colleagues, whatever, who can't paint unless they're like experiencing some intense sort of angst type of situation. I think for me, because my practice is so labor intensive and meditation is such a huge part of it, and I say meditation like I have to say I've never like consciously meditated. I don't know if someone like myself could consciously meditate, because what happens with me when I work is that I have to get past a certain conscious part of my brain in order to spend enough time in my studio to make the material that I need to make. And so I think that on some level, like a lot of my work is, I'm going to say, void of emotion, because I have to just have this like really sort of empty space in order to be productive. So yeah, that's an interesting question. I don't know that emotion is something I've ever really thought about in terms of the sort of either the making process or the outcome. You know, I'm always sort of thinking about things, I think, more scientifically. Yeah, I mean, it may not seem like that with my work, but it does come from that basis. So.
No, it does seem scientific. Both your work. For me, the transparency, the sort of the transmutation or transformation of materials in your work from something that metal to something that's very organic in your works. The idea, the sort of philosophical or intellectual idea of sort of a transmutation, you know, to a different realm of awareness seems to me, as a viewer, as an audience, something that I can respond to very personally, while also appreciating the research you do in your process. But
so I was going to say, I'm not sure. I think this is relevant. You know, when I first experienced the work that Alex is doing now, I think that there's a certain amount of, and disbelief isn't the right word, but there's a certain amount of like suspension that you have to be willing to undergo, and there's sort of a psychological experience that you have to be willing to let yourself have in order to really get into your work on a level beyond the mechanics of it. And I'm going to say that on some level, I hope that people can get into that in terms of my work and get beyond just the sort of like, you know, is it craft, is it gendered, is it women's work, is it, you know, whatever those constructs are that make up the vocabulary of what we do. I think that both of our work, there's an expectation that people are sort of willing to let go of some of whatever that is and really get engaged with it. You know, I found myself watching some of your videos over and over, and I appreciated that you sort of had that pause when you were presenting so that we could, like, this is what it takes to get past that first moment of just looking at and then potentially dismissing a piece of artwork. I'm not sure where that's taking the conversation, but we're just talking here, so.
Want to respond to?
Yeah, I think, you know, and actually connecting with your first question is about the motive and Tracy's comment of being willing to you know, open yourself up to the installation or video or whatever form that the piece takes. I really do rely on, you know, like all the information isn't there in the piece. It really relies on people bringing information with them. And Tracy and I had a long conversation at the installation site of the next piece, and we talked a lot about that, the preloaded information that a person has, and their expectation when they approach the door, whether it's, you know, a piece in the sculpture park or a piece at the Wiseman Art Museum. That preloaded information is very different, and how that they're able to apply their own experiences and I guess emotive states and background, and, you know, something as specific as you know, someone willing to have that relationship of, oh, this reminds me of that car that I went to school in, and that memory and that connection and that you know, whether it's a feeling of, you know, nostalgia or loss or whatever, you know, if that person's coming closed, it's not, they won't be able to engage.
Well, there are layers of meaning that you as the artist think about, that you don't necessarily explicate in terms of interpretive text or in other ways, that we talked about, whether it's myth or whether it's ideas about like American myth, from, you know, Bukowski, what have you, to Greek myth, to journeys from the Odyssey to Jack Kerouac. So these they're all sort of part of what I think the work at least communicates on one level, but I think also that the idea of myth too, as a viewer, I can bring to what you do, certainly in a different way, in different level. If you think of the Odyssey, right, there's Penelope. And then if you fast forward, I'm thinking like these important works of literature, the 100 Days of Solitude, Amaranta Buendia, who's doing and undoing her work every night. And then if you think about Joyce, Ulysses, and the way Molly Bloom's soliloquy at the end is a kind of tapestry. There's no punctuation at all, so it's like you're this endless tapestry. And all three women, their work sustains the entire epic story of each of those three novels in a way that's really interesting, but in a way about this kind of co-agency again of doing and undoing and fixing and doing. And so I guess this is my very awkward way of bringing you back to maybe myth, or what are your ideas about myth in relation to your work, and is that a valid thing to think about or bring to the work?
Yes, valid. I'm not quite sure how to put my finger on how to talk about it, but some of the things that you were just saying made me really think about references to my own life, which I think is really always sort of can do in terms of responding to something. And for me, having studied a lot of literature before I was going to say became an artist, have always been long aware of the stories of women, and particularly in textiles, and it's kind of an amazing thing after all this time that's like relevant to me, because it's certainly not something that you start out thinking is going to happen. I think with a lot of this stuff, it's like the meaning that your work becomes about isn't necessarily something that it set out to, at least not for me. It's like I figure out what it's about afterwards. And so thinking about this process of making and of doing and undoing, I look at the work that I do as being when I'm going to say common thread, and of course I can't help it because there's a pun there, whatever. But it's the one thing that's been consistent my whole life. So as I'm sort of doing and undoing all of the rest of the parts of my life, the actual artwork that I make is the one sort of consistent thing in all of it. So I know that's not directly addressing the issue of myth, but in thinking about myth in terms of like what's real and what's not, I don't.
Or just that space, again, that we were talking about earlier, that space that connects, that is in between the subconscious and the conscious, that sort of where myth is sort of created.
This is making me think about, so the closest thing I can get my brain to this right now is, and I shared this with you, Alex, a friend of mine sent me an email the other day, and she had just been over in Italy, and she said, I really think a lot about you and the work that you do, and when I'm here, and I find myself, I'm in this fabulous place where I find myself like slipping along this tide line between the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, between science and magic. And so, to me, somehow that speaks in an abstract way about myth, because in my mind, myth is this thing that it's like, it's this thing that's, I want to say just very simply, it's something that's made up, but it's also something that it's a system of belief that we base our lives on, whether we identify exactly what it is or not. So I think that sort of in an abstract way addresses how I'm responding to your...
Yeah, a belief system, and this is how you described it earlier, Alex.
Yeah,
correct?
and Tracy, I think it is so much of your work you say, well, I don't, it doesn't come from that like front mechanical place. It comes from this other area where it's flowing. And I've spent so much time trying to find that in each person and find this object, which I think everybody has a relationship to, whether it's like classic, or at least it's Pan-American. So, you know, that I'm not interested in this in a global narrative. I think that'd be too hard to pin down. It's you know, these are where I've looked at these very, very common things, whether they're you know, in one you saw the highway or the airport, where most people have a, you know, this experience of being there, and some things, you know, in future things, or, you know, even places like shopping malls that have, you know, taken interest in it, started to investigate. And it's not so much, okay, this place is interesting, or I think this place needs to be venerated. It's more of a, it's saying, if you start to deconstruct that place and then allow elements so someone can place their life, as their life crosses, you know, and intersects this place in many different ways, and, you know, it allows them to think of it abstractly. It allows them to move into that, like, kind of center zone that I charted out, and so it, you know, we live in a kind of interesting place in time, because there is no common myth that binds our societal values. We don't, you know, we learn about laws, we learn about you know, what's important to members of our society, being this country, and what's not. But we don't have a set of stories that instead of stories not saying that, like, the founding fathers is not a set of stories, but they don't border on the spiritual. They simply are, you know, historical documents. So, and so then I've tried to create environments which that this can happen. But at the same time, you know, it is a unique situation, because normally if you know this is what I'm doing and you know the formula and you go in there, then you're able to break it down. So.
Yeah, in a way also in your installation that is really quite, well, it's beautiful in a way. Beautiful in the way it's crafted, trying to get from the head to the hands, back to the hands, because the environment that I saw in your studio originally, which is now part of it, is reconfigured in this new exhibition with some new work. If you walk into this environment, it appears, if you're not looking carefully, to be an environment that has pre-existed, that is not by accident, but has a long history. And in other words, it's something that's very carefully designed and crafted in a way that is surprising. And that's something about your work that's interesting to me, the level of production value, whether it's in the videos or in the objects, and also the ability to take something that's analog and make it appear to be, you know, high tech, but also combining, you know, tech and analog in a way that is seamless. So you do it in a way that's seamless, and it takes that whole question of tech off the table in a way that it becomes just this, whether it's an installation or environment that you can then become subsumed within, and you can start to respond to it in your own way, in your own personal way.
Okay, yeah, that's right.
Yeah. So let's talk about craft. Let's talk about crafting, craftsmanship. How do you guys? That's craftsmanship. I think it's something I love. I've always loved. I collect craft. I'm not calling your work craft. I collect craft, but it's because from Hawaii I gained an appreciation for something that's highly skilled and made beautifully, whether it's clay or wood or what have you. And then so I can appreciate in objects the kind of care and time and skill that one applies to one's discipline, in your work particularly, but in yours as well in a different way. I mean, your research is object-based, and your research is more, how would you describe your research? I mean, you collect things too, but things that you then sort of try and figure out.
Yeah, the research itself is, you know, some of them start as like simply passing by, and I think maybe also in travel is like some of these objects or you know, like sometimes you walk by something and there's that epiphany of, okay, this is something I should investigate. There's this place or this instant is interesting, and you know, for me, since my work is not, I'm trying to make this more universal thing. It's not coming from a super personal place. I need to be out in the environment doing it, so that's part of like the area where the research comes from, and you know, connecting back to the comment of craft, I think, you know, and it's not so, you know, some of it's like, you know, there's like the craft of necessity. You know, it's just that you can't simply, you know, sometimes it's easier just to build it than to find another way to get it built or find it pre-built. But also became the understanding is that really, you know, craft at first was these very like, okay, woodworking and metalworking and these sort of things, and it's like, no, it's really, craft is anything, and it's, you know, there's a craft in the planning, there's craft in you know, in organizing your information, and there's a craft in you know, and also finding people that have the skill to do these things and bringing them in, and if you know, and if you're lousy at that, if you haven't refined that, even though that you might be utilizing someone with high craft, if you don't know how to bring that in and haven't refined your information transfer, it doesn't happen. And so that, I mean, yeah, that kind of that expanded realization of what craft is, I think, was important to me.
Well, and I think, you know, it's interesting that we've spent a lot of time talking together in the last couple of weeks, and we come to this from such different places, and it's but both equally engaged and serious and all of that about what it is we do. And you know, for me, craft. God, I can't even believe I'm talking about this, but because I don't talk about craft, you know, I mean, I feel like I got to the place with my work where all of a sudden I got picked up, you know, in the mid-'90s by a contemporary art gallery, and I was like, oh, thank God I never have to think about the word craft again, you know, and, you know, I get to hear all the jokes about the American Craft Museum and the craft this and the craft, you know, and I'm like, oh my God, you know, so I want to say that I probably spent, you know, 15 years of my life trying to just get away from whatever that was, but also knowing that, you know, you don't live your life dishonest. I don't live my life dishonestly, at least in terms of that. I have to own that's where my work comes from, and it comes out of this tradition of human connection and humans as makers. So our definitions of craft, I guess the part of craft that I put weight on for me has to do much more with the sort of process of making than it does the sort of, but I also understand that your work is like really, really contingent on people being able to like do what it is they say they're going to do. And so it's different when when you've got a number of people helping you out and you're relying on their abilities to be able to help you coalesce what it is what your vision. From someone like myself, I think about craft in terms of being that making ability that I have to rely on. You know, it's part of my self-reliance. It's the only way I get my work made is I make every single thing. So we have very different practices in terms of how we manifest our work, but I think that this notion that it's, you know, the success of it on some level is really contingent on a very high level of skill is really an important thing for you know, to both of us. So whether it's me being the person that's completely, you know, in charge of every little tiny detail, or you in charge of sort of choreographing this whole thing, I think that's where the difference is. But I think that it's you know, craft to me these days has so many different definitions, or so many different meanings, or it means so many different things in so many different ways that I sort of can appreciate having a conversation now, because we're not talking about, you know, woodworking and metalsmith. You know, we're not talking about these sort of you know, subgenres of art and making. It's really more of a way about needing something, needing to have something done, needing to have something done in a particular way.
Yeah, I think of it in terms of virtuosity. In terms of virtuosity, whether it's a thought, an idea, like you said, a well-crafted idea, or virtuosity with your hands, or in terms of organizing. Exactly. So, but I also love the idea of just owning your affiliations, right? Own the affiliations, because whether it's the sort of codified gender in both your work, you know, whether it's building and welding and this stuff, or whether it's, you know, weaving. I think it's important to own that, to, again, kind of, in a way, acknowledge it and get it off the table, because that's not what the work's about.
Yeah.
I mean, it's there, but that's part of the myth, part of the tradition, and
well, and I think we're both hoping that we're making compelling enough work that people actually, that is transcended. I mean, I think that's a really important thing for me in terms of thinking about craft, is like, I think I've probably built a career on it for the last 20 years trying to transcend what that is. I mean, in a way, that's very serious comment, you know. Yeah.
But your research informs that. I mean, the research, the small bit of research you showed me today, the textiles that you've collected from Guatemala are incredibly well crafted, but they're also artistically complex and beautiful things that inform what you do, and just to hold those, to feel the weight of them, to see the weave, to see the colors,
well, and just to figure out how they're made, you know. And it's like when I look at one of your installations, and I have to think about, oh my God, okay, you had to get this thing going, and you had to program it, and it all has there's a whole synchronizing that happens in terms of making something come out right, whether it's a, you know, piece of doubly cut fabric from another culture, or if it's something that's like highly mechanized and fine-tuned and has to perform in a particular way. Because I think all objects, you know, the sort of essence of objects is that they are made to perform in a particular way, and the success or failure of their ability to do so, I think, is oftentimes, you know, it's what success and failure is about. So, you know, my work performs in a certain way when it's exhibited, and in terms of what it stands for and what it looks like, and your work does the same thing. So, you know, in very differently, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I was inelegantly trying to say about the installation that what we saw this afternoon, the kind of the very intentional decision. The decisions made were very specific, and they did not begin when you got the space and started building it out. They began last year when you made that film at the gas station, or before then. And when you were describing, so you'll see when you go see the show, this incredible film, high-speed film, shot from above your car. But you told me that the camera was at an angle, which then it made sense to me because it's disorienting. I couldn't put it together. It's like, what am I looking at? And it's this loop that's very hypnotic and mesmerizing and very. I described it as very sensual too because of the speed, the timing. But then the wall, the support that the screen is on is also just angled slightly back and to the right, and that support is highly crafted and built and very intentionally built for that way. And then I realized the whole environment is like that. It's all askew and askance, and it creates not a feeling of anxiety, but rather a kind of wonder. For me, it's like a true environment where I can suspend my disbelief in a way, and really allow the work and the space to work on me. I guess again, inelegantly said, but that is highly crafted. That installation and that film.
About 5 minutes, so do we have time for Q&A from the audience?
Yeah.
Why don't I answer that
Yes.
really quick, and then, so the thing that, one of the things that when the craftsmanship of building an installation, and then the sculpture itself, especially could be illustrated in the Wiseman exhibition that I showed, that the support for the installation and blending the sculpture and this idea of like, you can't make a full illusion to anybody. Everybody knows that they're existing within this space. And so I had to find a high level of craft to say, this is pretending to be this, but yet it's still that. And for instance, there's the structure which suspends the chandelier piece and looks like the support mechanism for the light chandelier, yet it runs and physically connects into the sculpture itself as well, so that these lines are always being blurred and saying, oh, is this something that the museum staff constructed, opposed to, is that the actual sculpture, and who built this, and was it the sculptors and the artist, or was it this other thing? And, I think that answered that question.
Great. I think we have how many minutes?
Just about 5 minutes.
We got a couple minutes. If anyone has a question, yes. Here.
I'm going to give you the microphone real quick.
I just wanted you to address idea of your planning and expectations versus allowing for play and spontaneity and happenstance. Like Tracy, I was looking at your, especially the textile ones, the wire that have these intricate patterns and colors, and how much is planned ahead of time, how much you allow to come out as you create them. And then Alex, looking at the car one, there was a lot of play there, I see, in how you let it evolve versus the walkway being very planned out. And so I just wanted to see the interplay of planning and organization versus just allowing things the element of surprise.
So I'll give a quick response to that. We were talking about like just the idea of sketchbooks and how it is we prepare for what we do, and I don't plan at all. I usually have a half a dozen things going on in my studio at the same time, and the pieces often morph into each other. I'll start with something as vague like, I have this thing and I think I'm going to try to weave, I'm not even sure what I'm going to do. I think a lot of times it has to do with just sitting with the material for a really long time. And so I kind of feel like my whole studio practice is about just constantly making decisions and making new decisions. And, maybe 5% of the work is like I've actually figured out what I'm going to do, and now I have to kind of get down and gut it out and get it done. But I think the thing about having a long engagement and career doing this sort of meticulous, labor-intensive stuff that I do. The only way it works for me is because there is a tremendous amount of unplanned and spontaneous stuff that goes on. It may not look like it. The work is like really highly constructed in the end, but the choices are always sort of happening based on what happened before.
Yeah. For me, I had mentioned how much playfulness can happen in the process of filmmaking and then in the editing environment, but there actually is quite a bit of play too in constructing, or spontaneity in constructing them, but it's a pre kind of like final design where I make mock-ups or might make things out of inexpensive material to try out the size of things, try out how they feel. And then, it all depends on the environment you're in, because sometimes the curator's like, well, I have this exhibition idea, and, it might be a year away or 2 years away. And then when they come to you, the space has got to be different. There's some other things. And so the project changes. And so it's always good to, at least for me, there's kind of this like tryout, the clamp wood together, inexpensive screws or whatever, just to get through a real rough version of what you're doing. And but then like once I hit that threshold of like you've got to start ordering the real materials and doing it, then then it's kind of on a one-way street to getting it done. So.
Other questions? I don't mean. If you don't mind, thank you.
I just heard you talk about co-agency, Michael, and I was just curious as to what that meant, as I just haven't heard that term used before. I mean, I can kind of infer, but I think it starts to touch at how craft plays a role in your work, and I don't know, maybe just explain it. I'm curious.
Sure. Yeah, I guess I use that word in the sense that there is sort of there is not a hierarchy in terms of vision and tactility when making something. In the best of object-based art that I've experienced, that I appreciate, and what I see in Tracy's work, that there is, in other words, they're working at the same time, sort of equivalent kind of forces or what am I trying to say? Agencies. So when I was using it in terms of Tracy's work, in reference to hula, it's like one doesn't follow the other, but rather they kind of work together in this very kind of mystical kind of way, which is not mystical at all. It's about training and research and actually doing your homework and actually doing the exercise, right? I'm guessing, so that your body, your hand responds simultaneously with your eyes and your head.
But I also just think too, I use the reference of science and magic together in that statement that a friend of mine made, and I think that those two things are co-agents. When I think of things that have been part of my studio practice that would be co-agents, I certainly think that magic in this very sort of abstract way, you can follow a rubric, but it doesn't mean you're going to get a good result. There's always like some little thing that happens that sometimes really feels like it's outside of you in a way. Yeah.
Any other questions? No? Thank you. Thank you, everyone.